Policenauts is a spiritual successor to Snatcher and the second graphic adventure developed by Hideo Kojima. While it still features heavy sci-fi themes and draws influence from films like Blade Runner, it's also influenced by films of other genres, with the most popular comparison being Lethal Weapon. Is Policenauts a worthy successor to Snatcher, and should more people play this game? Before we get started, it's important to note that Policenauts was actually never given a North American release, so we played an unofficial fan translation of the PlayStation version of the game. Policenauts was first released on the PC-98 in 1994, before being ported to the 3DO in 1995 and the PlayStation and Sega Saturn the year after. The PC-98 version was much more basic compared to the other versions, and featured pixel art in comparison to the cell art of the later ports. When the game was ported to the 3DO, it received a graphical overhaul, with the PlayStation version fixing the graphics and small glitches even farther. However, the Sega Saturn port of the game was considered to be the most definitive version, and featured all content from other versions of the game, in addition to adding light gun support for the shooting sections. Policenauts was billed as the next generation Snatcher, which rightfully got fans excited for this new graphical adventure. Although Snatcher had not sold a lot in the US, by this point it had still gained somewhat of a cult following. Therefore, a North American release of the Sega Saturn version was announced by Konami. A mock-up cover for the game was produced, and Sega began promoting it in booklets included with other games. Sadly, according to an interview with Kojima in the official strategy guide, the English version of the game was cancelled due to the developers having trouble syncing dialogue to the game's already animated cutscenes. For the next 10 years, there was no way to play this game without being able to speak Japanese. Development of a fan translation began in 2006 and was finally released on August 24, 2009 for Kojima's birthday. This patch added English text to the PlayStation version of the game, and the game was made fully playable in English for the first time. Finally, in 2016, a translation was also released for the Sega Saturn port, allowing fans to play the definitive version of the game with an updated translation. So basically what it comes down to is that you need to do some work to be able to play this game. We played the translated PlayStation version, and once we applied the patch, saw no issues with how the game plays. All text is translated, with voiceover still obviously being in Japanese, but it feels extremely polished for a fan translation. If you've played or even watched our review of Snatcher, you've got a pretty good idea of how Policenauts works. Just like with Snatcher, the game is extremely story-based and we can't go into crazy detail, but here's a pretty comprehensive summary, keeping it as spoiler-free as we can with a game like this. In the year 2010, mankind's first fully functioning space colony called the Beyond Coast is launched into space. 3 years later, 5 of Earth's best police officers are chosen to maintain law and order on the colony as it develops, and are called Policenauts. Jonathan Ingram, one of these Policenauts, loses control over his spacesuit during a test and is lost in space, presumed dead by his friends and colleagues. 25 years later, Jonathan, who you play as, is found alive due to the cold sleep module in his suit, and is still the same age as when he went missing. While his friends and family have moved on, he now works on Earth, referred to as home in the game, as a private investigator. Jonathan's ex-wife Lorraine asks him to help her find her new husband, having exhausted all of her other options. While initially reluctant to take the case, he accepts after Lorraine is murdered soon after their meeting. Jonathan then goes to Beyond, and after being reunited with his old partner Ed, begins his investigation. As with most police investigation-oriented media, the story takes many turns, with Jonathan uncovering larger criminal activities that all seem to be connected. Just like Snatcher, the story here is great and it's extremely compelling. While I don't think the story is as good as Snatcher, it still wraps up very nicely by the end. There are, however, an extremely high amount of similar themes and tropes of not only video games, but movies and TV as well, and this leads to a bit of predictability and frustration during some parts of the story. One example being that nobody believes the main protagonist that a conspiracy is going on, with all evidence seemingly disappearing before anyone else can see it. You know how a lot of these situations will play out because you've seen them before. This doesn't take away from the game too much though, because the writing is great and the overarching story kept us very interested throughout. One thing that we definitely have to mention is the high amount of sexual situations in the game. You can interact with every major female character in the game, whether it be just flirting or straight up groping them, and it's definitely weird. The game even had a quote, breast bouncing supervisor. Hideo Kojima got into arguments with Sony over this and was forced to limit what was in the game. In comparison to the other versions, the PlayStation version features less gropable characters and less breast bouncing overall. This highlights the main issue while playing through the game, the translation. This game is a straight translation of the Japanese version and is not a localized version. This means that, like many other games we see, The cultural references and other things that would be changed or taken out of the English version are still there. This is not a criticism though, because this is a highlight of how different Japanese culture is in terms of these kind of jokes. Snatcher featured small amounts of this stuff, but this game just goes crazy with it. It's hard to say whether this is a good or a bad thing, because we don't have many games like this. All of that being said, we have to commend the fans who translated this game for the sheer amount of work that went into it, because without them, we couldn't have played this game. Overall though, I believe that this story is worth experiencing despite all of the issues we listed before. The graphics here are great. It pretty much feels just like you're playing an anime, a definite upgrade from Snatcher's pixel art. The visual fidelity really helps to bring you into the game world, and personally, I think it holds up today. The music is also great here, and certainly an upgrade from Snatcher. There's an increase in quantity and quality here, and the game's better for it. While there's still an issue of repeated tracks throughout the game, these tracks are much better, which overall leads to a less frustrating experience. The main theme is great, and it's likely a lot of people have also heard it before, even though they've never played this game, due to its inclusion in Metal Gear Solid. While on the topic, you might also notice a familiar character here from Metal Gear Solid as well. It also uses an Easter egg here that Kojima would later use for a boss in Metal Gear Solid in the PlayStation and Saturn versions of the game. If the player has data on their memory card for Konami's dating sim, Tokimeki Memorial, the game will have some additional text based on how you played that game. This game also introduced summary screens upon loading a save, which Kojima would use in Metal Gear Solid as well. These are used to refresh the player on the plot. This game features a ton of voiceover as well, and it all sounds phenomenal. It really adds to the fidelity of the game and makes the playable anime aesthetic really stand out. It's hard to think of a lot of games with this level of writing and storytelling released around this time, with as much voice dialogue as we see here. Again, if you've played or watched our review of Snatcher, there's really not much more we need to say here. You have look, touch, and a variety of other commands that you can do at almost any time. The main difference here is that you can freely click on anything you want in the world, as opposed to Snatcher's menu-based system. This allows the game to flow more organically and not make the player sift through so many options and menus for every single action. Policenauts also fixes one of the biggest issues we had with Snatcher, and that's you don't always have to examine everything in every room to progress. This issue is still there though, albeit in a less frustrating form. The shooting sections are also back and are much worse this time around. Instead of being on a grid like Snatcher, you can freely move the reticle around, making these extremely hard. They're also longer and just overall a pain to complete. If these games had taken out these shooting sections, we believe that they would be much better. Lastly, there is a bomb defusing section, which is very stressful and frustrating, but a welcome addition to the game. It features players sifting through purses to find one that's a bomb before going into a full-on bomb defusing minigame. It can get pretty frustrating at times, but in an effort to mix up the gameplay, we believe that this was a better choice than adding more shooting sections. Policenauts features that unique brand of Kojima's storytelling while sticking to the gameplay style established in Snatcher. While not as memorable as Snatcher, it's hard not to recommend this game to fans of these types of games as well as fans of Kojima. It definitely has its issues, but we believe that this game holds up and is worth playing if you have the means to play the fan translation. We purposefully didn't spoil too much of this game, because if any of you are interested, you should go play it. We hope that one day this game will receive the full North American release it deserves, but sadly I wouldn't count on that.